Thank you so much, Christoph. That's the most amazing story I've ever heard, or the most amazing framing I've ever heard. That was really wonderful, and I hope it was recorded. I'll send it to my mother. So I'll start out with the bit about shaky ground. I was supposed to give this talk on the 18th, and then last week I walked past the poster and saw my name there for the 4th. So this is another example of forging ahead on shaky ground, and I'll hope you'll forgive anything that is not well formed in this talk. But before I get started, of course, I want to thank some people, but also starting out first with the Rachel Carson Center itself, which includes all of you here in this room, all the staff and fellows and students and everybody involved with the center. This has been one of the most meaningful academic experiences of my life. It's just been such a fabulous experience, getting to write, getting to do my own work, getting to meet all of you, but also getting to know Munich and even Europe in a wider sense, because this is the first chance I've ever had to live in Europe and to really get to know Germany, and it's just been really, really wonderful. So thanks to the Rachel Carson Center, thanks to Christoph and to Helmut. Thanks to Ariel and the staff, as I said. Also, I want to thank Marielle Dado, who did this image mashup for me. You've got in the foreground a boy with his fighting cock or pet rooster, and in the back, what I'm trying to do with this image, I want it to be the cover of my book, but you can see merged into the background is an image of the virus. So this is supposed to be a mashup of virus and Indonesian avian worlds. So thanks to Marielle for doing that. And thanks also especially to the Multi-Species Reading Group, which wouldn't have gotten started without Ursula Munster. And so a special thanks to her as well. Okay. Biological futures, securing life in the avian influenza outbreak. It used to be the H5N1 outbreak, but I realized that nobody would know what I was talking about. So here we go. And I've been told not to lean on this, but I tend to, so if it just falls over in the middle of the talk, we'll just start again. Okay, H5N1 influenza, the cloud of infectious particles, uncertain ontologies, multiplying narratives, and apocalyptic dreams that spread from mainland Southeast Asia to Indonesian chickens in 2003 and humans in Indonesia in 2005 was a contagious viral agent that infected a multitude of living beings, domestic poultry, humans, wild birds, and other creatures, at the same time as millions of Indonesian citizens and scores of organizations were scripted into national and international concerns about pandemic preparedness, biosecurity, and sovereignty. Multiple ontologies within the outbreak were transformed amid encounters among indeterminate and imperceptible viruses, the immune systems of animal hosts, and the individuals and institutions that were asked to reckon with the specter of a potential pandemic. In my research, I followed poultry farmers, influenza scientists, medical doctors, and veterinarians in Indonesia, narratives of viral mechanics, and stories of illness and outbreak in humans and in animals to query the importance of signals from the viral realm, putting the virus at the center of things, and examining a range of new becomings which developed alongside of the highly pathogenic virus. Part of a larger work on the H5N1 outbreak in Indonesia with many moving parts, this brief talk today first observes that the international community securitized its response to H5N1. Second, describes biosecurity as a historically and contextually specific rationality. And third, relates some of the difficulties of infecting Indonesia with the norms of biosecurity that were at play for the international community. There are just a few things you need to know about the larger project to make sense of this piece of the story I want to share with you. Most important to the story is that highly pathogenic influenzas are not nature, nor are they quite culture. They are lively biological matter that mutates in multi-species assemblages and evolutionary contexts that, in the case of recent highly pathogenic strains of influenza, are of our own making, just like Christoph was telling you earlier. Recent instances of mutation to extreme virulence in influenzas have occurred almost exclusively in the context of industrial agriculture. If you hear in my work a tone of skepticism about the international response to the H5N1 outbreak, it is because there was almost no international effort to transform the industrial settings which have promoted the creation of new and deadly influenzas. Second, H5N1 only killed some 300 Indonesians in the last decade, while roughly 26 million Indonesians suffer from hepatitis C, malaria is drug resistant, and dengue fever is on the rise. On the other hand, globally, something like 300 million chickens died through sickness and culling during the outbreak. For human populations, H5N1 was a speculative event, something which might happen. The approach to forestalling something for which there is no historical precedent and which relies on technical analyses of hypotheticals is key to understanding how the intervention by groups such as the WHO, FAO, OIE, which is the International Veterinary Organization, and USID, key to understanding how the intervention by these groups developed and proceeded. And finally, you will hear prefigurings of a still underdeveloped theorization of this work through concepts of new materialism. Recently, I've been exploring the work of folks like Jane Bennett and Levi Bryant, who want to expand our thinking on material, non-human, and other than human agency as prerequisites for understanding contemporary situations. Bennett is seeking descriptions of, quote, a fuller range of non-human powers and more attentive encounters between people materialities and thing materialities. For Bennett, she says, things are not reducible in the contexts in which humans set them. The influenza virus, which, as I said, is neither nature nor culture, is an excellent object to place within conversations on lively matter. That is, matter which itself has a non-purposive agency and an ability to burst forth and change situations. Following these paths has meant as well that I'm attempting to shed epistemology for ontology. Nevertheless, as Bennett writes, cultural forms are themselves powerful material agencies with resistant force. So having told you this much, now I begin in the hamlet of Simbol in North Sumatra. In August of 2006, Coordinating Minister for People's Welfare, Abdul Rizal Bakri, Minister of Health, Siti Fadila Supari, and Agriculture Minister, Anton Apriantono, arrived in Simbol Hamlet in the village of Kabanjahe, North Sumatra. Stepping out from their vehicles, they quickly dressed in the white Tyvek suits, face masks, and protective eye goggles they had brought with them as measures of individual biological security. The occasion was an inspection of poultry culling, ongoing in the vicinity of a group of human H5N1 cases known as the Karo cluster. While there were no reported cases of H5N1 in Simbol, this part of Karo Regency was under heavy surveillance, as just 5 kilometers away in the village of Kubu Sembalang, 8 human cases had emerged in one family with 7 fatalities. The timing of those illnesses was the most significant indication that human to human to human, or what's called H to H to H, transmission could occur, and a dreaded sign of mutations to the virus which might signal the start of the prophesied human pandemic. The public appearance far outside the Indonesian capital of 3 of Indonesia's top ministers was designed to convince the people of Karo that the poultry culls going on in their community were part of an important national strategy to stamp out the bird flu. The visit was also intended to signal to the international community that Indonesia was taking the H5N1 outbreak and these most recent ominous developments seriously. I am interested in how these events in Cairo crystallize questions of who is being secured from what and how, and issues of how security was materially and symbolically enacted in the outbreak. The protective clothing worn by the ministers was intended to materially secure these important national figures from possible contact with the virus. The suits were an admission of the vitality of the Indonesian virus, a recognition that H5N1 was as much force as entity, to use Jane Bennett's words. To the people of Symbol Hamlet, however, the ministers must have looked like visitors from another planet. The populace surrounded the ministers, berating them and yelling at them to take off their masks and face the people directly. The hostile crowd demanded they stop the cull and admit there was no bird flu in Symbol. They were concerned with preserving their chickens, but also with the reputation the village had gained for being infected when they believed it wasn't. Under pressure from the mob, the ministers were forced to shed their protective gear, cancel their inspection of the village, and retreat to their vehicles. Years ago, I had studied the rise and use of biodiversity discourse and practice in Indonesia, seeking to figure out what, if anything, might be particular to biodiversity conservation in its Indonesian form. Now conducting multi-sited fieldwork in the worlds of Indonesian microbiology, security, and agriculture, I found myself chasing after another bioform, biosecurity. A term that has gained importance only in the past decade or slightly more, biosecurity is a contemporary rubric describing recent political and technical practices of securing life. When lively matter gets taken up within frameworks of security, human and animal bodies, narratives, and politics get re-scripted through fears and concerns for biological vulnerability. Biosecurity has been imagined and articulated most prominently in relation to issues of bioterror and biodefense, novel disease emergence, food safety, and invasive species. With the H5N1 event in Indonesia, concepts and practices of biological security interfaced with the materiality of the outbreak, reformatting the particularities of what would count as security and for whom. The incident in Symbol raises several important issues about contemporary practices of securing life. First is the importance of techniques that are attempting to physically separate humans, animals, and viruses. The H5N1 virus was doing something just 5 kilometers away from Symbol, although it wasn't clear what, and physical attempts to isolate the virus from susceptible humans and animal bodies were key to its containment. Questions of how the state understands life and places it under its control emerged alongside of concrete practices developed for making life secure. Second, if the village of Kabanjahe was really contaminated by a deadly viral presence, then why were only national political leaders being protected from it? The way that state security and population security intersect, and the question of whose security is at stake in new modes of biosecurity were central questions in the emergent outbreak. And finally, as there was apparently not enough danger to the people of Symbol for the government to protect the population as well as its leaders, its political leaders, I interpret this technological enactment of biosafety as a type of security theater, the performance of which would have intended and unintended material and political effects. Okay, this section is called Securing the Social from the Biological. Practices of biosecurity are about allowing in, confining, or separating out biological materials that are perceived to pose risk. Thus, biosecurity is the business of taxonomizing, classifying, and then excluding hazardous from non-hazardous life. As described by Kang Guiem, biological normativity is defined in relation to the abnormal. Likewise, the biosecure is defined in relation to the biohazardous, and separating the secure from the hazardous, like the normal from the pathological, is a political and material process inherently linked to realms of knowledge and value. Biosecurity names practices that prepare for the unknown and unexpected, allowing desirable matter to continue to circulate while containing dangerous circulations. Through regulations that integrate life with law, exclusion and preparedness are organized through a wide variety of legal and bureaucratic techniques. Old-fashioned plagues were contained through acts of quarantine and sanitation, and biosecurity still incorporates these measures. Additionally, however, overlapping juridical and preparedness functions of biosecurity respond to its speculative nature and are designed in anticipation of possible future events. Facing stark biological facts and uncertainties about possible eventualities, fears about a future influenza pandemic spread among world leaders in the early 2000s. Michael Greger, Director of Public Health and Animal Agriculture at the U.S. Humane Society, documented one set of typical reactions framing a possible H5N1 pandemic. He says, Senator Frist has warned that H5N1 poses an immense potential threat to American civilization. Tara O'Toole, director of the Center of Biosecurity at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, agrees. What we were talking about is not just another health issue, it's a nation-busting issue. This sentiment is expressed worldwide. It will be the worst nightmare, the president of Indonesia said in 2005. This plague can be more dangerous than the tsunami, which last year killed hundreds of thousands of people in a matter of minutes. The H5N1 virus emerged in the early 2000s adjacent to a series of events that produced an affect of biological anxiety in the global north over how secure contemporary forms of life and living really are. Following on the heels of September 11th, the September 11th bombings, the anthrax letters mailed through the U.S. Postal Service amplified and extended the vulnerability that Americans were feeling, expanding it to concerns for biological weapons. After the anthrax attacks, Americans were advised to stockpile ciprofloxacin as an antidote. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but it's so funny, it's hard to say. But we were advised to keep duct tape at home to seal our windows in the event of a biological attack. Both actions have dubious protective abilities, but instead provided the sense that one could do something to prepare for biothreats. Other national and international events styled as bioterrorism were taking place contemporaneously. In Britain in 2002, there was an alleged plot to attack the London Underground with the poison ricin. Most substantially in 2003, the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell demonstrated in an infamous dramatization at the United Nations that Iraq had biological weapons. This was later proved untrue, of course, yet the dramatic performance of the biothreat was sufficient impetus for the international community to agree to invade Iraq. Simultaneously building upon ongoing conversations about disease emergence, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS outbreak, and the H5N1 influenza outbreak added to the sense that human life was under renewed threat from the microbial. In 2002 and 2003, the SARS virus appears to have crossed the xenographic barrier by jumping from civet cats to humans in market interactions in China. SARS spread from Hong Kong to Canada and 36 other countries, leading to roughly 8,000 cases and 700 deaths. H5N1 influenza, which had caused human deaths as early as 1997, was also causing concern as it spread around mainland Southeast Asia. Collier, Lakoff, and Rabinow identified the breakup of the Soviet Union and the birth of genomics as the developments which inaugurated biosecurity in its contemporary form. While the end of the Cold War meant a shift from superpower conflict to undefined polymorphous threats, changes in genomic technology have made bioterror theoretically more possible at less expense. The simultaneity of designed and quote-unquote natural biological events in the early 2000s, along with assessments of the current state of bioengineering, resulted in the collapsing of the categories of those threats with human intentionality and those ostensibly ascribable to nature. In the mixing of purposive and non-purposive biological threats, the rationalities of health and security were likewise integrated and hybridized. Eugene Thacker writes, "If we consider the cultural, social, and political environment into which a pathogen is introduced, the effectiveness of bioterrorism has to do much more than with biological contamination. It also has to do with a political contamination of national security. This is the moment in which the biological body becomes inescapably political. Politics becomes biopolitics." In this context, new institutional formations began to take shape around the concept of biosecurity. While it is not a new thing for militaries to be concerned with disease, it was only during the Clinton presidency that an epidemiologist was first appointed to the U.S. National Security Council. Following September 11th, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, and the WHO joined together to create the Global Health Security Initiative. Launched in November of 2001, the GSHSI was designed around the concept of global health security to strengthen health preparedness and the international response to biological, chemical, and radionuclear terrorism. A year later, pandemic influenza was added to their mandate, notably placing influenza within the ambit of biological security. Following the reorganization of the security and safety branches of the U.S. government under one Department of Homeland Security in 2002, new legislation placed health, influenza, and terrorism into conversation through regulation of biosecurity. New legal frameworks included the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Act of 2002. Just listen to these titles and how they're integrating security and health. The Project BioShield Act of 2004, the Biodefense and Pandemic Vaccine and Drug Development Act of 2005, the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act of 2005, and the Pandemic and All Hazards, whatever those are, Preparedness Act of 2006. Recall as well discussions in 2003 on whether and who to vaccinate against smallpox, the only disease that has ever been successfully eradicated on a global scale, moreover using conventional public health measures, which now was re-envisioned as a threat to U.S. national security. Additionally, in 2004, President Bush issued a directive called Biodefense for the 21st Century that represented the United States and what he termed the civilized world as highly vulnerable to biological attack. Between 2001 and 2008, the U.S. federal government spent $40 billion on biodefense. Once something enters the realm of calculation as a biological risk, preparedness comes into play. Best characterized by its speculative and hypothetical nature, pandemic preparedness is an example of this. Whether or not something will become a speculative threat or not depends upon a reading of available data and information, and then its constitution as a form that can be acted upon. Readings of risk rely upon expert knowledges and styles of reasoning, as well as political mandates to become prepared. Securing against rapidly emerging disease threats and against bioterror has relied upon enacting scenarios that prepare public health and defense workers to respond should a threat become actual. Lakoff writes of the seminal tabletop exercise called Dark Winter, which took place at Andrews Air Force Base and was a simulation of a smallpox attack on the United States. While an exercise can demonstrate gaps in preparedness, it also may excite a sense of vulnerability based upon a particular script that directs a fictive outcome. Imaginative reenactments are subjectifying events that create persons who give particular credence and attention to proposed threats while ignoring other possible scenarios. Whereas in the United States, security concerns are linked to terrorism and laboratory safety, in New Zealand and Australia, biosecurity regulation primarily governs the entry of exotic species, and the French conversation on biosecurity has related to genetically modified organisms. Across these spheres, the concept of biosecurity reflects a broader securitization of the social. What some have taken up as a matter of environmentalism, others now respond to as environmental security. Food security and food sovereignty are competing paradigms for feeding national populations. And what once was the purview of public health now responds to a new globalized understanding of human and animal health as health security. Security is both an empirical form and a mode of study, contrasts with other epistemic and ontological possibilities. Foucault's concept of pastoral power, in which care of life was modeled upon the care of a shepherd for her flock, or a priest for his congregation, is but one example. The precautionary principle would be another. Carlo Kadaf illustrates the shift from population health to health security in his examination of former and recent pandemic influenza vaccination campaigns. Influenza vaccination programs were once a public health intervention intended to reduce morbidity and mortality. In the 2000s, the emphasis changed to preserving essential services and ensuring the continued functioning of security. The continued functioning of society. In this move, the list who would first receive pandemic influenza vaccine shifted from the most medically vulnerable, for example, health workers, the young and old, or those who are HIV positive, to those in the sectors of banking and finance, chemical commercial facilities, communications, electricity, emergency services, food and agriculture, healthcare, information technology, nuclear, oil and gas, postal and shipping, transportation, water, and waste. Lakoff and Collier have termed this new form vital systems security. While public health was designed to protect the fleshy substance of human bodies, vital systems security protects the hard materiality of national infrastructure. In the 2000s, media and scientific analyses alike played up predictions of catastrophe. H5N1 became a threat to U.S. civilization, nation-busting, and worse than the 2004 tsunami in Indonesia. Even critical geographer Mike Davis called the impending flu pandemic the monster at our door, not unlike the UN FAO, which called it the enemy at the gate. Bruce Braun defines biosecurity as a set of political technologies that seek to govern biological disorder in the name of a particular community through acts that are extraterritorial. Across the global south, governments and populations were required to take up and perform the dramatic genre of medical emergency preparedness. Naming particular extraterritorial communities not only as vulnerable to outbreak, but also as responsible for disease spread, creates the geographies of responsibility, risk, and blame described by Matthew Spark in relation to the swine flu outbreak of 2009. But to read northern preparedness practices and anxious affect as grounding biosecurity practice and discourse in Indonesia would be to miss the particularity of security talk and activity in the archipelago. Now I'm going to shift to Indonesia. Indonesian security, private, viral, vital. Indonesia is shaped by a variety of security formations that differ from those I've described for the global north. Practices that center on the safeguarding of stable transportation, communication, and public health infrastructures presume infrastructure that's lacking in Indonesia altogether or is present only for the elite. Toll roads, for example, form a visible architecture of apartheid in many cities in Java. These relatively well-maintained roads run through the center of major urban thoroughfares, allowing those who can afford it to whiz past traffic jams. Similar divides exist in the realm of healthcare. The Indonesian capital of Jakarta has state-of-the-art medical diagnostic technologies available for wealthy expatriates and citizens, facilities comparable to those available in Singapore or the United States. Most Indonesians get their health care from underfunded government clinics, however, that are only able to do basic diagnoses of common diseases like malaria with conventional microscopy. Warnings about a deadly influenza pandemic caused a great deal of anxiety in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, in the mid-2000s. But the anxiety was actually most striking among the expatriate community, and traceable in the US case to presentations set up by the American Embassy for the American Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia. These presentations painted a particularly bleak scenario. Quote, "You can't underestimate how afraid everyone is," one American management consultant told me. "How will we get out? If we wait and the pandemic strikes, all air travel will be shut down and we will be stuck in Indonesia." Expatriate views of Indonesia's public healthcare system and their view of Indonesian politics as edgy and unpredictable added to foreigners' feelings of insecurity in the imagined pandemic that seemed to be just on the horizon. On the trail of security narratives and practices that were proliferating in connection with the avian flu, I grounded my ethnographic work by visiting one of a burgeoning number of private international security firms operating in Jakarta. Lexington Security was a company run by a group of former Australian police and intelligence agents. After passing my passport under the bulletproofed glass, I was brought through a series of secure doors into the underground offices of Lexington for a tour with its president. Lexington's job is to develop strategic security plans for its clients for all kinds of threats, including natural disaster and political disruption. Services include instant messages and emails informing clients of demonstrations, terror threats, economic issues, court trials, airline accidents, and even traffic jams. Security analyses were carried out by young male Indonesian analysts who joked with the Australian managers as I watched them dissecting virtual security data from computer screens and TV monitors linked up to cameras mounted at client facilities. So they were spying on inside corporations, looking at what the workers were doing. Companies like Lexington take up the task of corporate security where the Indonesian state leaves off or is unable to follow in the post-authoritarian era. They date back only as far as the fall of President Suharto in 1998, when the uncertainty of regime change and the Asian financial crisis caused foreign corporations to look to the private sector to meet their security needs. In the case of an avian influenza outbreak, Lexington clients were directed to follow a pandemic influenza response plan that was part of a written security product provided to clients in advance. What a security consultant could provide in such a case was early information, enabling foreign workers to get a jump on leaving Asia. The ability to receive this information relied on the materiality of the cell phone network, however, and at Lexington I learned that the network would overload within 7 minutes of any catastrophe. With an outbreak of deadly influenza, Lexington would aid international clients to evacuate, while Indonesian staff would be left behind. Lexington staff were fully conscious of the racialized us and them in their exit scenario, and I envisioned an epidemiological fall of Saigon. Under epidemic conditions, however, a privatized evacuation would hardly have the support of the international institutions trying to stop the spread of disease by quarantining people in place. A firm like Lexington is only able to provide security based on a basic level of order and infrastructure, and the worst-case scenarios that were imagined for an H5N1 pandemic would undo this basic order. The parable of the elephant troops. Indonesian reactions to H5N1 then frequently differed from the concerns of foreign governments and expatriate workers and did not key to new formations of biosecurity or to the foreign logics of pandemic preparedness. The president of Indonesia's comparison of the pandemic potential of H5N1 and the 2004 tsunami, a natural disaster with tremendous toll on life and property, for example, indicates an ongoing concern in Indonesia with the older rationality of population rather than vital systems. Even still, scores of Indonesian professionals were interpolated into transnational programs of H5N1 surveillance. Amid anxieties about an emergent pandemic, Indonesian physicians were asked to respond to avian influenza to ease the anxieties of sick patients, virtually all of whom had the ordinary flu. Indonesian doctors were also asked to take a position in relation to the risks of the potential pandemic as described by international health officials and the Indonesian government. During one stay in Jakarta, I spoke with a doctor whose thoughts turned to the material agency of wild birds in conjunction with the virus. He was a general practitioner who held a degree in epidemiology from UCLA. He was not impressed by bird flu, however, and imagined it as a scenario conjured up by then-President George W. Bush, who he viewed as obsessed by threats coming out of the Muslim world. Maybe the reason President Bush was so worried about bird flu is because his advisors had told him a story from the Quran called The Parable of the Elephant Troops. In the story, an elephant army is out to destroy the Prophet Muhammad and his followers. The elephants were unstoppable until God sent a flock of birds to drop stones onto the elephants from above. In the parable, the agency of birds is scaled up to eclipse the power of armies and kings. Our conversation took place during the ongoing Iraq War, a war in which Western countries continued to drop bombs from above, transforming landscapes, lives, and politics on the ground of an Islamic nation below. It was a war, moreover, that was justified through claims for the existence in Iraq of weapons of bioterror, implying that the role of the United States in the international arena was like that of an army of elephants out to destroy Islamic nations like Indonesia. The United States appeared as a powerful material force that could only be stopped through divine intervention. Recognizing the conceptual similarities between an accusation of weapons of mass destruction and the claim that Indonesia was ground zero for the start of the next pandemic, the doctor speculated that if President Bush was afraid of H5N1 because God had once sent wild birds to save Muslims, maybe something like this could happen again. The parable of the elephant troops coupled security, science, and religion with animal agency and the materiality of military invasion. The H5N1 intervention also transformed possibilities for the physician, however, who, despite his status as a non-believer in a coming H5N1 pandemic, told me that WHO influenza funding was an easy source of support, and he would also be applying for a grant. In conclusion, biosecurity names a material set of technical practices that separate safe from dangerous forms of life, a mode of governance that administers life through law and regulation, and an affect of anxiety created by dramatizations and warnings that there is something new and dangerous in our relationship with microbes. One of the most basic properties of influenza viruses is their constant state of becoming in relation to other emergences. Rob Wallace writes, "At the risk of reifying arbitrary blocks of time, pathogens have their own origins, diasporic migrations, classical eras, dark ages, and industrial revolutions. As human pathogens evolve and spread in a world of our own making, these analogous eras are often coupled with our own." The H5N1 outbreak was coupled with an era of our own making in which chickens live in crowded industrial ghettos that are dirty, stressful, and select for pathogenic viral mutations, and in which the BIOS is being secured across the global north with similar expectations for the global south. As an influenza pandemic on the scale of the 1918 pandemic came to be viewed as a matter of if not when, The international response to influenza was developed as a question of national and international security, and countries like Indonesia were required to take up pandemic preparedness through techniques and rationalities that reflected this milieu. The Indonesian state, however, has historically sought to secure its own power against its own people, particularly under the rule of Suharto from 1966 to 1998, and not against the power of invasive microbes. The question as H5N1 entered Indonesia became, whose biosecurity was at stake? In Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter, she argues that rather than separate the human from the non-human, political theory needs to recognize the participation of non-human forces in events. Together with Latour's actor network theory, Bennett and other new materialists indicate that efforts to secure life cannot be thought outside the agency of the forms of life being secure or the life forms being secured against. In relying on an object-oriented ontology or a multi-species approach that does not demand things or critters to be passive, and in also recognizing the powerful materiality and resistant force of cultural forms, we can take up questions of life and well-being in new ways to ask what it might really mean to be secure and not securitized. Thank you.